Tifu by thinking smoking and drinking would be fine for my first and second time. It wasn't. Apologies, Reddit. This is a lengthy account. This narrative unfolds approximately 4.5 years ago, shortly after I graduated from high school. I had secured my first job about 6 months earlier. I considered myself to be quite a good student and person, generally avoiding wrongdoing. I would occasionally drink in social situations, but that was about the extent of my wild side. I had never used marijuana in my life and had no intentions of doing so until October 2020. I was invited to a small gathering hosted by some coworkers at one of their homes. There were about 6 of us, and I distinctly remember one person brought along gummies, a bong, and a blunt. I had consumed a few drinks beforehand and was feeling a little buzzed, nothing excessive, when I suddenly decided I wanted to try the gummies for the first time. No one at the gathering warned me that trying gummies as a first-time user might be a poor decision. Despite telling them in advance that it was my first experience and that my tolerance was 0, I ended up consuming half of a 10 mg gummy. Approximately 20 minutes passed, and feeling nothing, I proceeded to eat the other half. Another 10 to 15 minutes ticked by, and I felt slightly giggly, though I initially attributed this to the alcohol. For some unfathomable reason, I then grabbed 2 more whole gummies and consumed them before they were removed from my hands. Initially, everything seemed fine. I wasn't experiencing much, but around 10 minutes later, as I sat on the couch conversing with one of my friends, I suddenly felt the room begin to spin. I will admit that the first 20 minutes were not too bad. It felt strange because I couldn't quite control my actions, but I tried to roll with it. After that, however, things took a turn for the worse. The entire experience was not exactly a blur, but rather it felt fragmented. I began to express my fear to my friends, crying uncontrollably and asking to call my parents because I felt in desperate need of assistance. They would not allow me to call, fearing repercussions, and instead attempted to reassure me that everything would be okay. It's worth mentioning that I am a Christian, and I include this detail because, for some reason, I genuinely believed I was in hell about 30 minutes into the experience. There was a moment I recall when I walked into the room. This part might sound silly, but I actually said, "I'm in sound," which I can't explain. My eyes would shut, my body would collapse, then I would reopen my eyes and the cycle would restart, with everyone repeating the same phrases and motions. This continued relentlessly for what felt like hours. I was utterly convinced I was dead and would endure this forever. I also remember being outside, screaming for help. My friends tried to quiet me by covering my mouth, but I perceived them as demons, and I genuinely felt like I couldn't breathe. Yes, I know the story sounds absurd over something as inconsequential as marijuana, but it's the truth. I also recall being constantly thirsty, and whenever I tried to drink water, it propelled me back into that infinite cycle. Odd, right? I vaguely remember needing to use the restroom and pleading with my friend to accompany me for assistance. They told me I was a grown-up and capable of handling it myself. I did manage to go by myself, like a big boy. The rest of the night was quite disjointed, and while I don't recall every detail, I do know I repeatedly asked what time it was. Eventually, I fell asleep, and when I woke up the next morning, we were able to laugh about my terrible experience, which they claimed was the worst trip they had ever witnessed. I managed to regain my composure the following day, though I felt a bit shaken. Regrettably, my second encounter was not nearly as positive. If you found the first experience tough, this one was significantly worse. After the initial incident, I promised myself I would likely never use marijuana again. However, curious about experiencing a pleasant high without the terror, I wasn't actively seeking it out. People frequently offered me marijuana, and I consistently declined. Yet, around 2 years after my first experience, I found myself in a situation where I was willing to give it another attempt. A significant error. Coincidentally, it was again around Halloween. My best friend, let's refer to him as Gaby, was in college, while I was working and attending community college to avoid debt. He had recently moved into a house with another good friend of ours, let's call him Chris, and 2 other roommates. Gabe had been hosting gatherings at his place, which served as a means for many of us to reconnect. With Halloween approaching, Gabe and his roommate, whom we'll call Sam, wanted to organize a small Halloween party, and I received an invitation. It's also important to mention that I was talking to a girl at the time whom I had developed feelings for. Another mistake. She was supposed to accompany me to the party, but ultimately canceled, which left me feeling quite down. I wanted to escape my troubles and enjoy the evening. A few hours into the party, which had approximately 30 to 40 attendees, I only knew my two friends and Sam. I'm fairly sociable, so I didn't mind meeting new faces, one of whom was one of Sam's good friends, let's call him Dean. The gathering was quite small, and everyone seemed to be having a good time. I engaged in some drinking games. I wasn't intoxicated but was close to being so. While participating in these games, I ended up chatting with Dean about various interests, and it felt like I was making a new friend. At that point, Sam announced that his supplier was arriving with some blunts for anyone interested in sharing. I thought, why not? It had been a few years since my last incident, and I wouldn't be consuming gummies. Everything seemed like it would be fine, right? About 8 of us, including myself, went outside to smoke. By this time, I hadn't had too much to drink, but I definitely felt the effects. In hindsight, I should have approached this situation sober, but I didn't. Everyone was passing around the blunt, taking hits, myself included. I attempted to limit my intake, keeping my previous experience in mind, but I still ended up taking approximately 5 or 6 hits. Just as the blunt was nearing its end, Chris handed the remaining portion to me and urged me to finish it. I struggle with peer pressure, so when a few people encouraged me, I caved in and started taking substantial hits until it was almost gone, before returning it to Chris. I was foolish. Everything was fine until the effects kicked in a few minutes later, and oh boy, did they kick in. As soon as I felt the onset, a wave of severe anxiety washed over me, reminding me of my first experience. At that moment, everything began to spiral out of control. I stood up, pacing around the house in search of Gabe for help. I noticed Dean following me, which struck me as unusual. Nevertheless, I was too consumed by my anxiety to care. This part of the story becomes hazy because I don't recall much, but I vaguely remember losing control to the point that Gabe had to turn off the party's music to try to assist me. I called 911 for reasons that remain unclear, and I frequently had fleeting moments where my vision would turn black, akin to forgetting faces like a Polaroid fading. People's features would become indistinguishable. I could also sense that everyone was intoxicated, which rendered them unable to assist me. Going back to what I remember, Gabe and some strangers began praying with me, although Gabe was laughing throughout, viewing the situation as humorous. They attempted to serve me food, claiming it would help, but I rejected it, convinced they were demons trying to deceive me. I can't explain why. I also have a vague recollection of Dean acting oddly. I remember him getting very close to me, and even in my drug-induced stupor, I sensed that his behavior was inappropriate, yet I felt powerless to defend myself. He continually tried to inch closer to me as I sat on the couch. Although surrounded by people, they were too intoxicated to comprehend what was occurring. I recall Dean offering me food, which I declined, and when I looked back at him, I could hardly believe it. His pants were down. Yes, completely off. He quickly put them back on, but seemed to be waiting to see how I would react. Honestly, I couldn't process what was happening. He persisted in pursuing me, refusing to relent even as I attempted to distance myself. It proved incredibly difficult because I struggled to control my body. When I attempted to use the restroom, he tried to force his way in, and I had to physically push back against him, to mention I'm 6'2", so I couldn't just be pushed around, but the state I was in made it incredibly challenging. Eventually, I managed to lock myself in, but he continued to attempt to get in. From what I remember, he eventually gave up, which annoyed me because everyone else seemed oblivious. My friends were nowhere to be found, and I hadn't said anything to anyone. I concentrated solely on avoiding harm and surviving the night. As it became clear that I needed assistance, Chris led me upstairs to his room and essentially instructed me to stay there for the time being. I suspect they didn't want to deal with me. While everyone downstairs continued to party, I was upstairs, engaged in a personal battle. After Chris departed, I found myself on the bed, rocking back and forth as if I were some sort of deranged individual in a mental institution. At that moment, I believed I was dead once again. The reason was that I had convinced myself my marijuana was laced with something that had effectively killed me, obviously not true, as everyone else consumed it. but I couldn't differentiate between reality and fantasy. Hallucinations began to play out in my mind. I vividly imagined Sam confessing that the marijuana was indeed laced, while everyone around me laughed, watching as I collapsed to the floor. Gabe frantically called 911, but it was too late, of course. This never happened, but my mind was manufacturing these scenarios. I envisioned my family progressing through life, witnessing my sister give birth to her first child without my presence, and watching as the girl I had fallen for built a life without me. The pain was immense, feeling as though I would never see them again deeply affected me. I desperately wanted to reach out, to communicate, to see them. Just when I thought it couldn't get worse, I attempted to contact anyone I knew. No one answered, and when I called my brother-in-law and reached his voicemail, I could hear him weeping at my funeral. I left my brother-in-law a voicemail, expressing remorse, I suppose, for my imagined demise, which to this day he continues to tease me about. Shortly thereafter, the laughter I had once heard transformed into the cries of loved ones grieving for me because I was dead. I can still recall the sounds of their sobs and them questioning why I had done this. My parents, my friends, everyone. I was overwhelmed with grief and despair, unable to distinguish reality from hallucination, desperately seeking ways to ascertain if I was alive or not, but uncertain of how to do so. Suddenly, I began speaking, but it wasn't my own voice, nor could I control what was being said, yet the words escaped my mouth. It kept telling me how I could have achieved so much more, how I squandered my life, how much I had left to live for, but now it was too late. I remember crying, pleading with God for mercy. While I can't recall every word I uttered, I know I was on the brink of losing grip. Every minute felt like an eternity. I paced the room, went to the bathroom, conversed with myself, and I can't determine how long I was there. It must have been around 1 a.m. when Chris expelled me from his room, forcing me to go downstairs and face both Sam and Dean, which terrified me. I begged Chris to let me remain in his room, but his drunken state led him to tell me not to be cowardly and that I would be all right. Upon descending, I found they both appeared to be unconscious, but my mind was still racing. I remember grabbing a cross and holding it tightly, utterly convinced I was in hell. My feet felt as if they were burning, while I anxiously awaited what I believed were demons coming for me. Shortly after, I heard strange noises coming from Dean's direction. He was about 20 feet away, situated in a walk-in closet with a bed. Although visibility was poor, it seemed as though he lacked pants, but my preoccupation with various fears distracted me, making me overlook it. Somehow, I made it through the night. I think I slept for perhaps an hour at most, while the remainder was spent trying to keep my mind occupied watching Minecraft videos, if I recall correctly. When I finally got up, I was still riddled with anxiety. Though I was no longer high, I still felt miserable. I caught sight of Dean in that walk-in closet and felt pure terror. I wished to convince myself that what had occurred was not real, but deep down, I knew it was. I can't say what he actually did, given that my memories of that day are such a blur. I'm fairly certain I was all right, as I believe I would remember if anything truly happened. However, after everything, I called my parents and admitted what I had done. They drove an hour to pick me up, and I was so paranoid I required urgent care and medication. I didn't sleep for 4 days. Even now, over 2 years later, I occasionally experience anxiety attacks related to that night. Thankfully, they have become rare perhaps a few times a year, but I have been able to heal, largely due to the support of those close to me, especially my soon-to-be fiancé, not the same girl from the story. This account is quite lengthy, and I assure you this isn't a fabricated tale. It was anguish. Also, no, I have not touched marijuana since that night. Never again. In summary, I had gummies after drinking for my first experience with marijuana, and it was dreadful. My second attempt at smoking was even worse. Story 2. After 2 years of chaos, I finally snapped at my husband's ex for dropping the kids off early, disrupting my work at 6:20 a.m. I, 47, female, have been married to my husband, 49, male, for 6 years. He frequently travels for work. After we got married, he sold his house to the mother of his children and moved into mine with his 2 kids and my daughter. We lived approximately a quarter of a mile from each other. Initially, all the children were in daycare, but then came COVID and homeschooling. Once we returned to school after the pandemic, we collectively decided that his son and my daughter, having received cell phones during COVID to maintain contact with friends and family, could walk to school together with a group of peers, 8th grade. They mutually agreed not to return the youngest to daycare and instead decided to transport her back and forth on their assigned days. This arrangement worked well for a year. However, he was often not dropped off on days his father traveled, as his mother would pick him up in the morning, and he would walk back in the afternoon, waiting for about 20 minutes until they came for his younger sister. The two oldest children were accepted into a prestigious magnet program in a neighboring area, with the bus stop conveniently located behind our house. I offered to have his son wait at our home in the morning for the bus, instead of being dropped off at the stop. Without any discussion, they began dropping him off even when his father was out of town, and did not pick him up until around 4:30 or 5 o'clock p.m. I mentioned this to my husband the first time he arrived and found himself locked out, and he informed me that he had permitted this without consulting me. The morning routine didn't concern me at that moment. It was bothersome because, unlike my daughter, whom I could instruct to get ready and leave on time, his son would linger and argue about the departure time, occasionally causing them to miss the bus, which then required me to drive them. It was inconvenient, but not a major issue, so I let it slide. However, the afternoons became significantly more problematic because I was often unaware of when he would be leaving. He enjoyed playing with the dog, and whenever they finally arrived to collect him, his sister would want to come inside to see the dog, retrieve items from her room, etc. I work full-time, supporting surgeons who often can only schedule meetings in the late afternoon. Additionally, it is worth noting that when they moved in, I relinquished my home office for his daughter, meaning my only workspace was in an open-plan dining room, which I managed for 3 years. After the first year of high school, it became evident for various reasons that we needed to relocate closer to the school. They struggled to attend extracurricular activities or receive extra tutoring because there was no bus service. Someone, namely me, had to leave work to drive a 50-minute round trip to pick them up in the early afternoon. Furthermore, the lack of space became increasingly problematic for my job. Although I was nominally a hybrid employee, my office announced it would close at the end of the fiscal year and switch to a fully remote setup. When he is not traveling, my husband works remotely from the laundry room. Financially, it was challenging due to high interest rates, but we found a great house significantly closer to the school, although none were available in that school district, leaving them without a bus option. I agreed to develop a schedule allowing me to drop them off and pick them up. For the first 3 months, my stepson still took the bus from his mother's house on her days, while my stepdaughter completed the school year at her middle school. Their custody arrangement states that children attend school in the district where the father resides, but our district does not require a change if they are already enrolled for more than half the year. This is also important because they attempted to keep my stepdaughter at her old elementary school when he first moved, were caught due to this clause, and were required to transfer her. Prior to closing on the house, I asked my husband what the plan was for my stepdaughter during her mother's time. He said it was her mother's responsibility and assumed her boyfriend would drive her, despite having threatened multiple times to stop taking her due to behavioral issues in the mornings over the years. Fine, that was not my issue. When school began, I asked him whether her mother found a way to transport my stepson to school, since I had suggested several times that she apply for a waiver to allow him to continue taking the bus, but I would be happy to drive him on days when he had activities. He replied, "No, she will be bringing them here," followed by the question, "When?" And he stated, "Every day." I pressed, "No, I do not want to deal with that, especially when you are away and particularly with my stepdaughter." His response was, "She doesn't have a choice." I insisted, "That is not my concern, remember?" And he persisted, "It will be fine, I will handle it. You don't really have a choice." Spoiler alert, it has not turned out fine. The mother was informed that she could bring the children at 6:30 every morning and pick them up on her way home from work around 4:30 or 5 o'clock p.m. She has delivered them too ill to attend school, dressed in pajamas, and with unbrushed hair and teeth, causing my stepdaughter to create a mess in my bathroom while getting ready. She has dropped them off at 6:30, even on delayed or canceled school days without prior notice, which posed a significant issue since I would not otherwise have taken my daughter to school on such days due to road conditions. And at times, she dropped them off amidst arguments that began at her house. She has also failed to drop them off without notifying anyone beforehand, and dropped them off on a Monday, even after being informed over the weekend that I had COVID, forcing me to rise at 6:30 while feeling unwell, leading to her son contracting COVID as well. And she failed to communicate about my stepdaughter's participation in various uncommunicated activities that were the reason she was not taking the bus home. The biggest issue, however, has been her consistent failure to bring the children at 6:30, particularly when she knows my husband is out of town. She often arrives earlier, essentially whenever she feels like it. This has been a persistent problem for 2 years, and I am the one managing it, as I am the one awakened early despite averaging only 4 hours of sleep per night due to medical issues. Consequently, I complained to my husband about communicating with her since I did not want to interfere in their relationship. He claimed he had spoken to her, and her response was that she was apologize and appreciated the predicament, leading to a temporary halt, only for it to restart again. Eventually, he began to downplay the issue altogether, asking, "Why are you so upset about 5 minutes?" I was frustrated because I was already losing sleep to accommodate her, and she could not simply be punctual. It is so disrespectful that I barely engage with her now, whereas I used to like her and often defended her actions to him as a rational voice. I informed him at the end of the last school year that I would not continue to tolerate this situation. He stated he would handle it before school began. I emphasized that we needed to sit down together to discuss how to make this work and what we all, including the kids, who are now 14 and 17, needed to do to make it less disruptive for me. Did that happen? No. I asked 3 times, but the answer remained negative. On February 13, she dropped the kids off at 6:20, and I was furious. However, I chose not to argue about it. That afternoon, he mentioned something about going somewhere with her and her family, and I expressed that I was not interested in participating with someone who does not respect my home enough to adhere to one simple instruction. Naturally, a major fight ensued, and I declared that he did not need to say anything to her because if he was not going to make her stop, I would confront her directly next time it happened. He left town on Wednesday and Thursday, and predictably, the kids barged through the back door at 6:25. I sent them both a text message stating, 6:30 means 6:30, not 6:25, not 6:28, 6:30. If you cannot respect this while I am doing you a major favor, then I will no longer be providing this favor. She, of course, reacted angrily, shouting that this was no favor to her, that it was their house, and questioning why she should be grateful for coming to their own home, saying that she would transfer them to her own district immediately, etc. I responded, "Or you could act like an adult and say, I appreciate you doing this and can respect your schedule moving forward, instead of ruining your daughter's 8th grade year by making her change schools with just 3 months remaining." There was more back and forth, and ultimately, I concluded the conversation by stating, "I am done with this discussion." I regretfully reacted with a laugh emoji, admitting to being passive-aggressive. The kids did not come on Friday. I don't know how they reached their destinations, but my stepson went to school, and when I returned home from dropping off my daughter, I saw my stepdaughter at her bus stop, approximately 5 minutes early, engrossed in her phone, so whatever. After calming down on Friday night, I sent her mother a very nice, thoughtful, and lengthy text addressed solely to her, not to my husband, and attempted to provide her with an exit strategy. I had conversed with a friend who generally believed I was not in the wrong, but inquired how often my husband had spoken to her, because the tone of her messages suggested it had been infrequent or that he hadn't communicated at all in a long time. Considering she obviously does not see this as a favor despite what he has asserted to me for 2 years, and feels entitled to come and go from my home at her convenience. I took this reflection to heart and decided to message her, expressing that I did not wish for the children to feel unwelcome in their home. It's also noteworthy that one suggestion we have made to her twice thus far was for us to keep them through the school week, while she could have them in the evenings and on weekends, which she declined. And that, to be clear, my issue has always been with her arriving before 6:30, and the reasoning behind it. My friend had offered some alternative suggestions we hadn't previously discussed, such as her allowing them to get dropped off in the road instead of our driveway, which would reduce the likelihood of the dog barking at the car when it pulled in, and advising the kids when they arrive early, along with talking directly to them about being quiet on those mornings. I included these suggestions in my message. I could manage all the rest of this if she simply adhered to the 6:30 rule or engaged in a mature conversation about it, selecting a time and sticking to it. My concern is that if I propose 6:20, she will show up at 6:10, and we will be back to square one. I also reiterated that I particularly do not want my stepson to believe he cannot participate in activities because he thinks I will not pick him up and will have to use the bus. We relocated here, paying 3 times my monthly mortgage, specifically to avoid that situation for him, yet here we are. She did not respond, of course. Now, I am particularly concerned about the weather conditions next week. I do not want my stepdaughter to be outside in the cold rain when she could simply be inside at 6:30. My stepson joined the French club recently and wishes to play tennis, both of which I would gladly transport him to and from as needed. Anyway, it is evident that the children's mother believes I am at fault. My husband thinks she is at fault, but believes I should have silently tolerated her behavior for the next 5 years to avoid conflict between either of us. And as a result, I have now also become at fault in his eyes because he believes this will lead to court proceedings. My mother and friend believe she is at fault as well. However, my father believes I am the one at fault for causing arguments between the parents. I do not believe I am in the wrong because I have exhausted all other options to resolve this before losing my temper. Yet somehow, of all the parties involved in this situation, the mother, father, mother's boyfriend, children, I am the only one whose schedule is disregarded and who is expected to adjust based on the daily whims of someone who clearly does not care or appreciate my efforts. Frankly, I would also likely be all right if my husband would have a conversation with the children about being quiet and cleaning up after themselves, or simply agree with me that their mother is indeed at fault, regardless of whether he planned to confront her on the matter. Perhaps he could remind her to be mindful of timing when he is heading out of town. However, largely because I genuinely care about these children, especially my stepson's school activities, if the consensus on Reddit is that I am at fault, I will also welcome your suggestions on how to apologize or make amends. Story 3. I broke up with my ex-fiancé after he became controlling and accusatory. He blocked me, unleashing hurtful messages, leaving me feeling conflicted. My former fiancé from Mexico, 20 years old, and I, 19 years old, from the United States have known each other for about 5 years. We initially became long-distance friends on the Discord server Lofi Girl. We connected well, entered into a relationship within 6 months, met multiple times, and eventually became engaged. We had a solid plan for him to come to my university in the United States and for us to live together. Our plans were well thought out and realistic. However, one significant issue I was unaware of was my ex-fiancé's diagnosis of borderline personality disorder. I never learned about it because he was always on medication, and he never disclosed it, nor did anyone else in his family. He also came from a troubled family background marked by various forms of abuse. While I faced my own challenges growing up, they were not as severe as his. I was the main source of support for him, encouraging him to pursue success whenever he felt like giving up. Over the years, our financial situation fluctuated significantly, but whenever one of us was better off, we helped each other out. For example, when I started college at 16, he assisted me with my textbook expenses, and when he needed money for food, I provided that as well. We managed to maintain a balance, supporting each other equally over time, ensuring that neither of us suffered financially or emotionally. Overall, the relationship was not bad. Problems began to emerge when I started college. I had attended high school virtually, which meant I was readily available whenever he wanted me. However, once I began university, my schedule changed. I had classes and became busier. I continued to communicate with him daily, but I was not as accessible as before, which I made clear to him. He persuaded me to share our locations on multiple platforms, grant him access to my accounts, and send regular photo and video updates to verify my whereabouts due to his intense insecurities and jealousy. I tried to overlook it, understanding his struggle with PTSD stemming from family issues, but I now question whether this was ever normal. I had to provide him with 24/7 location access, send photos or videos as proof of my activities, grant access to all my accounts, including school accounts, and keep him informed about everything I did. Once, when I signed up for a Cash App account and he saw an envelope on my desk during a FaceTime call while I was giving him a room tour, he erupted in anger and nearly ended our relationship. He justified this by saying we shouldn't hide anything from each other, claiming that my failure to inform him about the Cash App before I registered was a red flag for possible disloyalty and dishonesty. He also needed to know when I was eating or showering and wanted to see my homework to ensure I couldn't lie about my workload. On one occasion, I experienced a PTSD attack that led to suicidal thoughts. I am better now, and it was a one-time occurrence, thankfully. I had to be admitted to a local mental institution for safety reasons. At that facility, they confiscated my phone. Consequently, I could only text him at the end of the day, only to discover a barrage of missed calls, texts, and threats due to my 4-hour absence and my phone being off. I provided him with proof of my visit to the institution, but he still did not believe me. Another incident occurred when I was severely ill with COVID-19 and had to go to the hospital. Because I was bedridden, I communicated my inability to text as frequently as usual. He was fine with this for a day, but after that, he accused me of cheating and claimed I was with someone else. The situation became incredibly stressful, and I eventually learned that he had stopped taking his medication for borderline personality disorder, which, at the time, I hadn't known he suffered from. It is important to note that the panic attack that led to my hospitalization was triggered by him. After taking an exam, I broke up with him because he accused me of taking too long, suggesting it was likely that I was unfaithful. To add some context, the exam took me 50 minutes, and I had sent him photos as I entered the classroom. Our breakup was chaotic. He hurled insults at me in every conceivable way, only to later call and leave sweet voice messages, begging me to return to him. He stalked me, attempted to hack into several of my accounts, and sent numerous threatening emails. If I blocked him, he would create new accounts or contact others who knew me. We were apart for 6 months before reuniting because he sought therapy and resumed his medication. Initially, everything was great for a couple of months, but eventually, the cycle repeated itself. He went off his medication again and became controlling once more, resulting in a full-circle situation. After some time, we broke up again amidst another crisis. He attempted suicide and blamed me for it. Thankfully, the attempt did not succeed, and he is now healthy and alive. Over time, I entered a relationship with a wonderful guy who has been supportive throughout my healing process. Things have improved. I maintained a friendship with my ex, with the knowledge of my current boyfriend, who is accepting of it. However, despite still having strong feelings for my ex and our shared history, he began to exhibit erratic behavior once again. He struggled to manage a normal friendship and became upset if I took more than 30 minutes to respond to a text. If I didn't address him with terms of endearment like baby, dear, or love, he would become angry. I want him in my life because of our history and my genuine care for him, but he caused so much stress. I foolishly begged him to stay when he threatened to block me. Yesterday, I allowed him to block me. He has blocked me on all platforms, accompanied by numerous hurtful long messages expressing that I never loved him and labeling me toxic for being with someone else. He told me I was a horrible person for moving on and even suggested that I should harm myself. Now I am questioning whether I am in the wrong. Perhaps I have failed to recognize something. Did I misstep? While I feel that I acted correctly in many ways, he seems to know how to manipulate my guilt. I also wonder if I should reach out or send an email expressing my gratitude for him leaving, as it honestly feels like a burden has been lifted off my shoulders, despite my ongoing tears over the last day. Any advice or opinions would be greatly appreciated. I am eager to hear your perspectives. I also needed an outlet to express my feelings. Thank you.